Chapter 8. Ian. I turned around. It was Robert. He moved around the crush of kids streaming through the corridor towards the classes. So why weren't you there Friday night? Robert asked. Why wasn't I where? I asked. Jen's party. I forgot all about it, I said. You missed a good party. Lots of food, some beer, lots of ladies. So where were you? Justin asked. Community service hours for civics. On a Friday night? He asked in disbelief. Like I have a choice? I have to put in the hours. No. Too bad. A couple of the girls were even asking about you. Anyone in particular? I asked. The usual suspects. The bell rang, loud, echoing through the hall and setting off a wave of activity as lockers slammed and kids hurried to class. See you at lunch, Robert said. Sure, see you. I had completely forgotten about that party and I'd been looking forward to it. We filed into class. I just hoped I could get my usual seat at the back of the room. Ian, Miss Watkins asked. I stopped. Instinctively I wondered just what it was that I'd done wrong or failed to read or hadn't handed in. But really there was nothing, at least nothing that I could remember. So did you go back to your placement this weekend? She asked. I stopped by her desk. I was there on Friday night. I put in 6 hours. In one night? She sounded surprised or like she was doubting me. It was a long night. There are a lot of people to feed and lots of works to do. I'm going back tonight. I'm impressed. Impressed or surprised? I asked. She gave a little smirk. Both. You think you could tell your classmates about your placement at the end of class today? I could, I guess. Excellent. I turned to walk away. By now all the seats in the back of the classes were taken. I did a quick scan of the room. The only open seats were in the front row. I took the one farthest off to the side. Now, as you recall, Mrs. Watkins began, from our last class we learned that contrary to what some people may have thought, Lester Pearson was not a left-winger for the Toronto Maple Leafs. We learned that he was a Canadian Prime Minister who received the Nobel Prize in 1957. Does anybody remember what Nobel Prize he received? There was no answer. It wasn't that I didn't know or that lots of people didn't remember. It was just that we didn't necessarily volunteer what we knew. Surely somebody must remember, she prodded. Best supporting actor, a voice chipped in from the back to accompany the latter. How about if I give everybody an additional assignment if somebody doesn't give me the right answer, Mrs. Watkins said. Peace. He got it for peace, a voice yelled out. Right. It's good to know that I'm not completely wasting my breath when I talk. This Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Lester Pearson because of his pivotal role in the conception and creation of the United Nations peacekeeping force. Since 1956, there have been peacekeeping missions throughout the world. These missions have been in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Central and South America. Does anybody know exactly what roles are played by the peacekeepers? Keeping the peace would be my guess, Mrs. Watkins, Kelsey said. She shook her head slowly at the chuckling as the chuckling died down. The roles of the peacekeeper can vary tremendously. Peacekeepers can be used to disarm warring factions, to protect against or repatriate refugees, she said, tapping her pencil on the desk as she recited the list, ensure human rights, supervise governments or elections of the government, train or supervise local police forces, ensure the distribution of relief supplies, and most often stand as a thin blue line between the sides that are or were at war. She paused. Why did I say blue line? And before anybody can give a smart-ass answer, it has nothing to do with hockey. Because that's the color of their helmets, berets, and vehicles, said a girl sitting just behind me. Obviously, at least one person has done the reading, Mrs. Watkins said, trying to look stern. Since most armed forces try to avoid being seen, their uniforms and vehicles are in browns or greens or sand colors, depending on the region where the conflict is taking place. Rather than trying to blend in, the UN peacekeepers want to be seen. By being seen is hope they can avoid being mistaken as combatant. Mrs. Watkins took a sip from the coffee sitting on her desk. Since 1956, Canada has had over 1,000 members of our armed forces in these missions. We have contributed soldiers to more missions than any other country. That is why we are known around the world as peace-loving country. Obviously, nobody's been watching us play hockey, somebody added. Obviously not, Mrs. Watkins agreed, but there is a cost. Peacekeeping missions, although sanctioned by the United Nations, are primarily paid for by the countries that supply the soldiers. There is also another cost, she paused. Being dressed in a blue helmet or driving in a blue vehicle doesn't make you bulletproof. Since its inception, there have been over 1,800 deaths of United Nations peacekeepers. There was a gasp from the class, but not from me. I knew the number because I'd done the reading on Sunday. I'd actually found it pretty interesting. This number seems large, but remember there have been hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers from countries around the world that have been posted in these missions. Does anybody know which country has suffered the most fatalities? India, I said quietly. That's right, Ian, she said, spinning around to face me. I didn't think she would have heard me. They have suffered 109 deaths. Do you know which country had the second most deaths? Canada, 107 and counting. She nodded, and counting. As we speak, there are Canadians serving in missions in the former Yugoslavia, Africa, and Central America, the Middle East, and Asia. For relatively small armed forces, we have approximately 60,000 men and women in uniform. We stretch ourselves around the globe. Mrs. Watkins took a sip from her coffee. Just out of curiosity, does anybody here have a member of their family who is in the armed forces? There was no response. Does anybody even know anybody who's in the military? Again, no answer. Surely somebody must know somebody who is in the military. I do, I said, sort of. He was sort of in the military, or you sort of know him, Mrs. Watkins asked. I sort of know him. Is this somebody you've talked to recently? This past week. And will you be talking to him in the near future, she asked. Probably. I could, I guess. In that case, I have an assignment for you, Ian. I cringed. Why hadn't I kept my mouth shut instead of showing off? Actually, it's an assignment for Ian or anybody else who would like to earn some bonus marks. So this is a voluntary assignment, somebody asked? Completely, she said. Although there are some people who could clearly use the bonus marks if they hope to make grade 10 civics a one-year project. She wasn't looking at me, but I knew she was talking to me. The assignment is to interview a member of the armed forces, to ask him or her about where they were assigned, to discover if they're part of the United Nations sanctioned peace mission, to get their opinions, to hear their experiences. That is the assignment. Any questions? The only question I had was whether I could afford to risk not doing the assignment. I didn't think that was an option. Before we go any further discussing our reading, I'd like to take this opportunity to have Ian tell us about his community service placement, Mrs. Watkins said. Great. I thought she'd forgotten about me. I slowly got to my feet and turned around so I was facing the class. I guess that was one good thing about sitting in the front, although if I'd been at the back and kept my mouth shut, she probably wouldn't have remembered I was even there. If I'm not mistaken, Ian is the last person in the class to report on his placement. Is there anybody else, she asked? Nobody answered. I just stood there on display, the poster boy for being the last. Was she trying to make me look stupid? Please, begin, Ian. Sure, I said, I'm volunteering at a place called The Club. It's a place that feeds street people. Do they, give out sandwiches or something, a girl asked. No, it serves meals, real meals, beef stews and spaghetti, things like that. It's good food. Sounds like you've tried the food, Mrs. Watkins commented. I know what it looks and smells like, and the people really seem to like it, I said. I didn't want anybody to know that I'd eaten there. I helped serve the food and clean up afterwards. So you like the cafeteria ladies, a guy at the back, Jason said, and then chuckled. I'd known him since grade 5. I hadn't liked him since grade 5. Do you have to wear a hairnet too, Chris, his friend asked? There were a couple more muffled chuckles, and I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at the two guys, the two jerks. I looked at one, then the other, then focused on the first, locking. I stared Jason down until he dropped his eyes to the desk. Jerk, wimpy jerk. Maybe out there on the downtown streets I wasn't tough, but here was a different thing. People who've never been there might be tempted to make stupid comments, I said, my eyes still on the two guys, daring them to say something, even let a smirk cross their faces. Neither did. It's not just about serving food, it's about saving lives. These people would die if it wasn't for programs like this one. It sounds like you've really made a difference, Mrs. Watkins said. Not me, I protested. I just show up and help out a little. The guy who makes it work is Mac. He lives there. It's not uncommon for people running these sorts of places to spend an enormous amount of hours at the work, so it seems like they practically live there, Mrs. Watkins said. No, you don't understand. He really does live there, in the back, but it's also his life. It sounds like you admire what he does. I guess I do, I admitted, although I never really thought about it until this conversation. I'd been confused by what Mac did, by his dedication, although I also gave him credit. Whether you believed it was something admirable or not, you had to admit that he was prepared to back his beliefs with his actions. He walked the walk. He reminded me of Berta that way. She was always doing something for her church or driving people to do things like hospital appointments. And I didn't even want to guess how much money she sent back to support foster children in Guatemala. Do you think that this gentleman would be willing to come to our class and speak sometime? Mrs. Watkins asked. I burst out laughing before I pulled the laughter back inside. He's pretty busy, way too busy to waste this time talking to a bunch of kids in some stupid civics class, I thought, but I didn't say. He sounds really dedicated, Mrs. Watkins said, approvingly. She turned to the class. I was wondering, when people think of street people, what comes to mind? Give me one word. Just throw them out. One word? Homeless, Kelsey said. Definitely homeless, or they wouldn't be on the street. What else? Drunks, drug addicts, Justin said. Runaways? No, I said, not the people we're feeding. These aren't kids. These are men, almost all men, older men. Some are really old. Other words, Mrs. Watkins asked. Bums, hobos, crazy as a loon, one of the two jokers at the back said. The term is mentally ill, I said. I wasn't finding either of them particularly funny today or any other day. Calling people crazy or loony or saying they're a few bricks short of a load or a nut is all part of a dangerous process, Mrs. Watkins said. If somebody is a nut, then they are no longer a person. And if they're not a person, then you can treat them as less. That dehumanizing process allows people to feel it is acceptable to treat them badly. Mrs. Watkins took another sip from her coffee. Any other words? Worthless, a girl, Heather said. Nobody said anything. The word just hung there and everybody just stared at it. I knew this girl. She was smart and nice. She hadn't said it to be mean or a smart ass. Ian, Mrs. Watkins said, are these street people worthless? I shook my head slowly. Nobody is worthless. I guess the real question isn't, are they worthless, but are they worth less? Less than other people? Nobody volunteered an answer. Ian? I knew what the correct answer was, what I was expected to say, that they were worth just as much as anybody else. Well, I'm supposed to say that everybody is worth the same, I said, but that's not the way we treat them. How do we treat them, Mrs. Watkins asked. We treat them like they're worth practically nothing, or so maybe that's what society really does think of them, I said. The bell rang, startling me so much that I flinched. On that note, class dismissed. People started getting up and gathering their books and belongings, and I expect those who didn't complete the previous readings to complete it before starting on the next two chapters, all to be done by tomorrow. Expect a surprise test, Mrs. Watkins yelled over the noise of the crowd. There was a chorus of groans and boos and comments. Mrs. Watkins turned to me. And Ian, can you please stay behind for a few seconds? Was this becoming a trend? I went over to her desk and waited as everybody else shuffled out of class. Ian, are you going to interview that member of the armed forces? She asked. I'm going to try. Good. You could use the mark, she paused. Ian, do you ever wonder why I'm so hard on you? I shrugged. I just thought you were on everybody. She laughed. I'm just more on some people. People I think have potential but aren't using it. People like you, she said, tapping a finger against my chest. Me? Don't try to sound so surprised. You know better than anybody else that you hardly ever give it your best effort. Although it does seem like an awful lot of work to act so uninterested, detached, and bored all the time. Wouldn't it be easier to just do all the work instead of trying to figure out a way around it? I'm going to try to interview the soldier. Interview that soldier, I protested. Don't try to do it. Do it. See you tomorrow.